what we're talking about today really touches everyone in this room. And not only that, it also touches corporations, nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, and communities. And you have the benefit this morning of being one of the few, part of one of the few public conversations since the Giving USA annual report on philanthropy was released in June. But before we begin, I am really pleased to introduce my very esteemed panel and colleagues. I'm going to start to my immediate right with Laura MacDonald. Laura earned a national reputation for her dedication to the nonprofit sector. She is a certified fundraising executive with decades of experience in nonprofit leadership, fundraising, and philanthropy. In 1999, so celebrating their silver anniversary, she established the Benefactor Group based in Columbus, Ohio, to serve the needs of those who serve the common good. And I'm happy to also announce this morning that Laura is the author of the new book, The Endowment Handbook. And in fact, she will be signing copies of that book after we finish this morning. So we're all very excited about that. To my far right is Susannah Darrow, has worked with the mission-based organizations across the Southeast for over 15 years. Susannah also is one of the founding partners of Purpose Possible here in Atlanta. And Susannah is really, I look at Susannah and think of her courage because she started this organization during the height of COVID in 2020. And since then, she launched Atlanta-based Purpose Possible, and really what it is doing is transforming communities and empowering mission-based organizations, not only here but throughout Washington, D.C. as well. Susannah will be serving as president-elect of the Atlanta chapter of the Atlanta Fundraising Professionals in 2025. And last but not least, right in the middle, Dr. Una Osili. She holds the Ephraim Son Chair in Philanthropy and is Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. She also serves as the Dean's Fellow for the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. She's an internationally recognized scholar in economics and philanthropy, and Una leads the research and writing of Giving USA, the annual report on American philanthropy. So that is our esteemed panel this morning. Would you please give them a round of applause? And we're actually going to begin with Dr. Osili, who's going to give us some context and opening remarks. So Una, please.
Good morning, Atlanta. I have to bring you greetings from Indiana. This is an exciting time to be in Georgia. When I told friends, family, they were like, "You're going where?" But I have to say, it has been wonderful. I feel like everywhere I go, there's just excitement. Of course, there's anxiety, but most of all, and traffic. But I feel like it's great to be in a place where every single day, people are transforming communities. I spent the evening yesterday with colleagues at Purpose Possible, and just hearing the context and how over the past few years, many organizations are really reaching next level aspirations. So I'm here today with that message of possibility, letting you know that this is a moment like none other, not just in politics, but also when we look at the landscape. You may have heard a lot of maybe messages around doom and gloom, but not today. Not today. Turn to your neighbor and say, not today. Yes, because when we look at the data, what we do see is that over the past few decades, philanthropy has grown, it's transformed, and there's also just between economics, technology, and the demographic shifts we're seeing in our population, I think it's a great time to be in philanthropy and fundraising and in the nonprofit sector more broadly. So I'm going to walk you through some of the slides. We're going to go through this quickly because we want to leave time for questions, for discussion, and for engagement. This is such a cool location. I want to shout out Chris for his bold vision and courage in saying, I'm going to just buy the theater. And it's wonderful that we get to spend time in such an amazing location. So let us get started. So let's start with, I'm going to introduce you, take you behind the scenes. You may have seen this data before, but you haven't seen it done in this way, I promise. Every year, our team works round the clock. I'd say we start every year, once we launch the first Giving USA, we start working on the next one. And over the decades, we have actually coined a new phrase at the Lilly Family School, and it's pertinent today because we bring together some timeless concepts. The first one is philanthropy. Philanthropy, everybody knows that word, but many of us do not know what it actually means. It means the love of humanity. So every day when you work in philanthropy, you get to actually show people what it means to love humanity around the world. The second concept is a powerful concept, and it's also the concept of measurement, metrics. And at the Lilly Family School, we fuse these two timeless concepts, the love of humanity and the idea of measurement. Philanthropy itself is not new. It is present in every culture that we study, every society that we study. In fact, it is something that is universally felt, whether it's in Atlanta, in the Northeast, in the Midwest where I live. We see philanthropy across the United States. Every single race, ethnicity, and community has a tradition of philanthropy. The word metric is actually newer to the English language. When we start looking at when it first shows up, it's actually in the 1800s that we have the metric system. But today, for the first time, you could say ever, we have the idea that we can measure philanthropy. And technology has actually made it possible to study in real time how people are responding to appeals, to fundraising letters, and campaigns. So when we bring these two, we came up with this new word, philanthrometrics. And I want to challenge all of you to start to embrace these two concepts, the idea that you can measure as well as give. And I want you to turn to your neighbor and say philanthrometrics very quickly. Philanthrometrics. And that is on the slide here, philanthrometrics, the idea that we're going to not just do amazing things, but also measure and track and learn as we go. So I'm going to take you behind the scenes to our Giving USA data, show you what philanthropy looked like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very quickly, because we're in a movie theater. We have to move quickly. And then also what it looks like today. So you heard the good news, and that was that philanthropy grew in the past year. The growth was about 1.8%. It did not quite keep pace with inflation. So there was growth, but inflation grew at a faster rate. When we put it all together, we are at an unprecedented moment in American philanthropy. When we count how much is given, it is over, basically it's close to $500 billion and exceeded $500 billion. And this is the largest philanthropic economy we've ever had since we started tracking. And actually, the U.S. has the largest philanthropic economy in the world. The nonprofit sector, there are about 1.3 million nonprofits. In terms of jobs, 13% of employment. So this is a significant sector. We don't hear as much in the policy domain right now about what will happen to the nonprofit sector. But when we look at American generosity, we've seen persistence during difficult and challenging times, whether politically or economically. And I think that should give us all hope and resilience as we move into this election season. When we look back in the probably 50s, 60s, 70s, even in the 80s and 90s, I'll tell you what I have been paying attention to. First, individuals are still the lion's share of American philanthropy. That was the case in the 50s and 60s. It certainly was true in the 80s, and it's true today. Individuals still account for the most important slice of the pie. So what should that tell all of us? As we're doing our work, we need to start with the people. The people that we work with, our donors, our stakeholders, our communities that we serve, those are the core segment of American philanthropy. Now, what has changed in the last few decades? One slice of the pie that has grown is the foundation segment. It was only about 5% of giving. Today, it's 20% roughly, which means 1 out of every 5 charitable dollars comes from a foundation. Now, should that change how you are addressing fundraising? I'd say yes and no. It still starts with individuals. Half of the foundation segment is made up of family foundations, which means people are still driving those decisions. And so building those relationships matters, and it matters more than ever. Now, on the corporate side, you may say, well, what's happening with corporate giving? Atlanta is home to a lot of companies, so many people want to know what's happening on the corporate side. Corporate giving accounts for about 5-6% of American philanthropy. That was the case in the 50s and 60s, and that hasn't changed very much. So if you put all this together, what happened in the past, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Individuals are still the lion's share of American philanthropy. There has been some disruption, mind you. Foundations have grown. A lot of the wealth that's being created in the country, the good news is some of that is actually being used to create foundations. We saw that a lot of the foundations in the United States, they were created in the 1990s. And this accumulation of wealth that you hear about is actually good news for American philanthropy because we've seen foundation assets grow. If you've been watching the stock market recently, you can also translate that to say that many foundations are seeing a record appreciation in their assets, which means it's also a good time to be building relationships with foundations. On the corporate side, I'd just add that the corporate segment has stayed relatively the same, but underneath that umbrella, we're seeing corporations evolve. They're embracing matching gifts as a model, matching not just dollars, but also volunteering by their employees. They're approaching giving with a strategic emphasis. And many of them are experimenting with new forms of giving, such as impact investing. So the umbrella of corporate philanthropy seems to be expanding. And as we look at that landscape, we expect it to continue to evolve. Now, let me talk about what isn't talked about enough, and that is the bequest segment of charitable giving. That is a place where we've seen transformation. Many large gifts being made, and a lot of the institutions that we talk about today here in Atlanta, around the country, were the result of bequests. In the data, you can see that bequests now account for about 8% of charitable giving. But when we look ahead, we expect that growth to continue. Why? Because for the first time, we have a very large demographic of older Americans who are reaching their peak giving years. Many organizations have been, you could say, slower to embrace planned giving, to make those investments. So I would encourage all of you to start thinking about how do we build the planned giving element. It's certainly long-term thinking, but it does pay dividends. Now let's go to just very quickly talk about what has changed since the pandemic on the side of the distribution of those gifts. So we know that $500 billion is given in the United States. That's a big number. But where do all those gifts go? The distribution of charitable giving. That's where we've seen, if I had to say disruption, that's where we've seen disruption. So very quickly, the biggest slice of the pie is still religious congregations, churches, houses of worship, religious organizations of all different types still receive the lion's share of American philanthropy, but it has changed. In the 60s, 2/3 of all American philanthropy went to religious congregations. Today, that's down to less than 1/3. Now, I was so struck by this data that I reached out to a colleague of mine who was a pastor in the 1960s, and I had coffee with him. I said, can you explain what's going on? And of course, there are lots of trends underneath that. Fewer Americans are participating in religious services, and fewer are attending and affiliating with religious congregations. However, faith still drives a lot of giving. So don't think that people don't care about their faith traditions. They're just changing where they give to. During the pandemic, we did see giving to human service organizations take the lead, more people giving to groups that are addressing basic needs in communities, and that has continued. We've also seen the rise of giving to the environment, especially among younger Americans. We did not track environmental giving until 1987. And to drill down even further, during the pandemic, Climate Works Foundation reached out to us and said, how much is being given to support climate causes? And we said no one has tracked that. So we embarked on a project during the pandemic. As you can imagine, it wasn't an easy project to embark on, but we did manage to get a top-line number on how much nonprofits are spending on climate philanthropy, and that is estimated to be between about $7 billion and $9 billion. It's a small slice relative to all of philanthropy, but its trajectory is quite rapid. It's growing rapidly. Now, turning our attention to, so this is what philanthropy looks like right now. Let's look at the changes that are taking place very quickly. And I just want to skip ahead and share with you one of the areas that we have been tracking very carefully at the Lilly Family School is the changes in how people are giving, where they're giving, and who's doing the giving. One of the biggest insights from our research during the pandemic is that at a very difficult time and challenging time for many Americans, we did see donors step up in their giving, which means among those who were giving, they actually gave more. And so this should all be good news for you in the audience, meaning in a challenging moment for many Americans, giving was prioritized. Many households continue to support the organizations they care about. So the message here is this is a great time to engage donors, to build relationships, and ultimately to be in philanthropy. Now, as I kind of look ahead, I know we don't have all day, so I'm going to try to start to wrap up. We're going to think about the future of philanthropy. This is something I have spent a lot of time thinking about because in addition to the economic data that we track and the demographic trends that we're tracking, we're also looking at how technology is affecting giving. I am struck by two things. One is, of course, the age-old, everybody, I think at least everyone at the School of Philanthropy knows this quote from Andrew Carnegie, that it was harder for him to make the money than to figure out how to give it away. So we are at a point where there are many Americans who are in that same position. They've accumulated assets. They are now at the point where they are thinking about how do we give it away. So your job is to actually help those households start to see the nonprofit sector and the organizations that you serve as possibilities. The second one is actually a phrase that came out of, many of you know Jim Collins, The Good to Great. How many of you have read his book? He says from all his research that it's harder to run a social sector organization than a for-profit organization. Why? Because the objective function is, I'm putting it in economic speech here, but I'll translate later. The idea is that the objective function is not as precise. If you're running a for-profit organization, you have one goal usually, it's to maximize profits. When you're running a social sector organization, you have a multiple set of objectives. You, of course, have to meet your mission, which could involve a lot of different categories. You have to serve your community. You have stakeholders in the community that you have to align with, and so forth. So he argues that it is more challenging. And I want to add a caveat today to say that not only is it more challenging, but it's actually more rewarding to work in a social sector organization because every single day you get to make a difference. When we look into the future of the nonprofit sector, there's a lot to celebrate. The health and strength and vitality of the nonprofit sector is something that we've seen throughout the pandemic, where many organizations had to pivot, had to figure out how to serve their communities virtually, meet virtually, work on Zoom. All of those things were new skills that all of us had to learn. So I think you should actually turn to your neighbor and give them a pat on the back, or at least thumbs up, like what you did was pretty amazing. And we see that in the data. So I think the data makes that point, that at this moment in our history, philanthropy actually not only was able to maintain its foothold, but many nonprofits were able to innovate, find new ways to reach donors and serve the communities and meet their mission. As we look into the future, I just want to highlight a few data points that we've been tracking. One that I have been watching for quite some time is the fraction of giving that's taking place online. For a long time, it's grown very rapidly, double-digit rates, but still remained under 10% of all giving. During the pandemic, there was an inflection point. Giving as a share, online giving, rose to become 13% of all giving, so double-digit rates. And that growth has continued. Now, I want to caveat that by saying that we saw that jump up across a lot of other domains. Many consumers started buying more online, shopping online, medical care transformed, where more services are being accessed online. The challenge for many nonprofits, though, is that we were not necessarily set up to build engagement, virtual events, and so forth. So organizations across the board have made that pivot. But that's not the only pivot we have to make. Today, we now have artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, many new products that are being developed, and forms of giving. And so the call to action today is, how do we meet this moment? Changing economic landscape and political landscape, demographic shifts, a country that has an aging population, but also a more diverse population than we've ever had across race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, and so forth. And then finally, technology, which is literally changing opportunities to give and engage donors. So I want to leave you with some of the, I'd say, kind of messages that we have been able to distill from all the years of and decades of collecting this data. To prepare for Giving USA, the rollout every year, one of the things I've started doing is going back to read some of the older Giving USAs from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. And the biggest lesson learned, I guess there are three things. The first one is the resilience of American philanthropy. Through good times and bad times, Americans have given. And importantly, during difficult times, they've actually given more. The pandemic showed us that, 13% increase in the average amount donated. And for high net worth households, that increase was about 40%. So very significant increase during the pandemic. We also saw the rise of mega giving during the pandemic, where many donors like McKinsey Scott accelerated how much they were giving. In fact, in 2020, she gave $6 billion alone. The second point that is very apparent from the data, another call to action, is to recognize that generosity is a core value for all Americans. As we look at our donors and our communities, the challenge, the call to action for all of us is, how can we engage all of the donors in our communities, recognizing that generosity knows no race, no ethnicity. People of all backgrounds are generous. In preparation for this talk, I asked one of my colleagues at the school to share some examples of large gifts that were made from diverse donors here in the Atlanta region. And everything from the Emory Business School is named for a former Coca-Cola executive who comes from a diverse background. There's so many examples that you can choose from. And then finally, as we look into the future, I want to encourage everyone, this is the time to really think about the possibilities. The resources are there. We saw the data, $500 billion given in the United States. This is a time of abundance and not scarcity. So what are the things that we can do to really, one, meet the moment, set the vision, engage our donors, and ultimately build trust? When we look at the data, the point that really stands out to me is that this is a time of a lot of distrust. People distrust in Americans' distrust or mistrust in institutions is at an all-time high. And we especially see that low level of trust from our younger Americans. However, there's good news in the data too. The trust levels for the youngest Americans are very low, but trust in nonprofits and philanthropy is higher than almost any other institution. In other words, although people distrust institutions, they have a higher level of trust in nonprofits and philanthropy, which means we have a unique position in our communities to continue to build that trust, to set an example for others, and to show what is possible. Americans still think that nonprofits are a place where they can find solutions, where they can actually invest in to move the needle on a social issue or a social problem. So I just want to stop by saying There's great news in the data, Giving USA this year. There's certainly challenges ahead, and I don't want to minimize any of them. Inflation is something that continues to be a challenge for many American households. We've seen a lot of political volatility, not just in the United States, but around the world. But what has been consistent in this data has been the resilience and innovation and promise of American philanthropy. So I encourage all of you today to lean into that potential and promise. And I love the fact that your organization is called Purpose Possible. The message is really the power of philanthropy and the possibilities in the philanthropic sector. This is a time of a lot of innovation, so I encourage all of you to embrace that promise, and let's go into the end of the year, the last quarter, the giving season, with that optimism and excitement.
As we listen to Una, we can once again underscore how timely and relevant the conversation we're having this morning is. And I'd like to start by asking a question to our panel. We're going to take a deeper dive into a lot of the areas that Una touched on, and so let's get started. So I'm going to start with a data-driven question, and that is, so charitable giving reached $557.16 billion in 2023, growing at some 1.9% in current dollars. However, the growth did fail to keep pace with inflation, and Una did touch on the fact that inflation is impacting some of this. So it lost a little bit of its purchasing power. So I'd like to ask the panel, what was your experience? What did you see in your sector and with your clients? Did you observe any donors who were cautious due to inflation and unrealized fears about a recession?
Thank you. And thank you, Una. Una and I have been traveling companions. I had the privilege of serving as the board chair of the Giving USA Foundation for a number of years, so it's wonderful to sit here next to you today. Benefactor Group works with organizations across the country, often in capital campaigns or capacity building projects. And I think that what we saw is a couple of things, that the likelihood that somebody will make a gift is influenced in part by how comfortable they feel with their economic circumstances. And I think that that's more likely to be buoyed by what they see as the rising value of their retirement assets than the occasional discomfort at the grocery store when they're buying another gallon of whole milk for their grandchildren who consume it at incredible rates. And so what we tended to see was that donors, there was this outpouring of generosity. But the other thing that we need to understand is that donors respond to the cues that we as the nonprofit sector send them. And so what we saw was that the organization that had, let's say, a donor society and asked their donors to give $1,000 a year, first of all, they've probably had that donor society for decades at $1,000 a year. And the value of that $1,000 has changed considerably. And so unless we then go out and re-engage and retrain our donors that same donor society is now $1,500 a year, they're going to give that $1,000 and it's not going to have the purchasing power that it did last year or 20 years ago. So I think what's really important is to think not just about the supply side, giving from donors, but also the use side. $1,000 doesn't go as far within our organization, and so what are we doing to inspire that same donor to make a $1,500 or $15,000 or $150,000 gift, not the same $1,000 that they've become comfortable with?
Yeah, I would very much echo that, what Laura shared. I think what we've seen, and I think what's interesting about this, we were talking last night, that within the Giving USA report, it's aggregated information. And so our primary base of clients that we're working with are small to mid-size. So it's generally within that. And our focus is a bit more on more of that annual operating. And I think what we've seen is I think is somewhat consistent to that. I think that the consistency of some of those long-term donors who are legacy donors have been involved with the organizations has stayed the same. I think we have not seen a huge increase in necessarily the scale of the gift going up, which is difficult when every other expense that organizations have, particularly in an annual operating budget situation, has gone up exponentially, that has really put a lot of organizations in a bit of a pinch in the last several years, and that it's making it to where there are a number of organizations we're seeing that are operating in deficit budgets because the giving rate for individuals just hasn't scaled with those donors. So I totally agree, Laura. I think it's really incumbent on that kind of education piece to really move that forward in terms of understanding why those numbers need to go up.
But do you have a sense that those donors are feeling less generous, or that the organization keeps asking them for the same $1,000? Or some of both?
That's a really good question. I think one thing that's been interesting, I would say, coming off of the pandemic, I think a lot of organizations, especially in the human services range, there was an increase in the number of donors, in the number of donations, and I think retaining those donors has been difficult. I think that there was that immediate influx of support, and that retention's been difficult, and I think that within that it is somewhat of, I don't want to say that it's less generosity. I think that it is a bit of distraction of other things that have come up, and that has taken away some of the focus on continuing to give to those organizations that have become reliant on those gifts.
So as we work with clients daily and we see, some of those deficits, there are some sectors that are faring better than others and have traditionally fared better than others. So I want to ask Susannah and Laura to address this question. So the sectors that have fared the best have been traditionally supported by high net worth households. And so could you share some of your clients' experiences that may illustrate this donor base showing the same tilt towards wealthier donors?
This is a question I know for us is we think about a lot. I think in particular one of the sectors that's cited for that is arts and culture, which in Atlanta, that is a very loaded topic right now. And part of that is, I think, generally, yes, there is that tilt towards high net donors supporting those sectors. I think, again, getting into that disaggregation of what that looks like across different sizes, the arts are an area where there are major gifts that are given, but those are continue to be given to traditional institutions that are at those larger sizes. So for Atlanta, as we know, the Woodruff Arts Center tends to dominate a bulk of those donations. And I think one of the issues that comes up is that smaller organizations, in particular within the arts is a good example of that we've seen, tend to really be left out of a bit of that resilient donor base. And so while there is support for some of these sectors, I think in a lot of cases what we're seeing is that small organizations are really left out of that, and that the sector as a whole is not benefiting from that donor activity.
Yeah, we were, when we chatted about this, there's a report that came out just this morning from the Giving Tuesday folks that apparently does, I haven't had a chance, it just came out this morning, I haven't had a chance to read it, but it does disaggregate some of the giving based on organization size and gift size. I'll also say that the Fundraising Effectiveness Project has some of that data that looks at receipts by gift size. And as we talked about it, we do a lot of work in arts, culture, and humanities across the country. That's one of the ones that attracts high net worth donors. Education, especially, which is dominated by higher education. I sometimes ask for a show of hands. How many of you have been contacted by your alma mater in the last 3 months and asked to make a gift? Yeah, they're cleaning our clock, people. We got to learn from them. And then healthcare and public and society benefit, which is where we see the gifts that are going into the large national donor-advised funds. But the debate that Susannah and I were having once again was, is that because of the behavior of the donor or the behavior of the nonprofit organizations? And I'll give you for instance, in our own hometown, so I live in Columbus, Ohio. Our firm is based there, works nationally. My daughter happens to live here in Atlanta. Is there anybody here from the YMCA? Where she serves on the board? No. So we have a second home here in Atlanta. And back in Columbus, we're working with a group called the Maroon Arts Group. They had an opportunity to acquire a historic theater in Columbus that has always been a vibrant part of the African American community. And there was a fear that it would go to development or go to a different kind of an owner. Maroon Arts Group stood up and acquired that theater. And what they were able to do was mobilize donors, small scrappy organization, and all of a sudden they're looking at a $9 million capital campaign. There was nothing in their history that would suggest that they could do that, but what the heck, we were willing to link arms with them and take that journey. And if you Google them, you'll see that they have now succeeded in that acquisition. And it fired the imagination, certainly, of some of the traditional donor community, and by that I mean in Columbus, Ohio, yes, largely white, older, and male. And it mobilized many other donors. There's a wonderful report out called from the Donors of Color Network. It has a heartbreaking name. Philanthropy always sounds like someone else. And in that, what you will see is that there are 1.3 million households in America that are headed by a person of color. And so when we, I think that when we talk about diversity of gift size, of donor core, sometimes we're the ones who need to do the hard work to mobilize those folks to give and to inspire them to give to our organizations. I will say we define high net worth, I think this is still true, as...
Yes, so in the high net worth study that we do, and we have had an oversample of diverse donors, so diverse donors include high net worth Asian American, African American households, LGBTQ, and also Latinx donors. It is $1 million in investable assets, and that excludes their primary residence, and the income threshold, that's a minimum, is $250,000 in assets. Bless you. But the average I'd say asset base in that group is $10 million in investable assets. And here I want to underscore one of the reasons we added that diversity oversample is we wanted to change the narrative to make sure people understood that diverse donors come from all backgrounds. It's not one race, it's not one ethnicity, it's not one gender, and we're seeing that play out in the nonprofit sector. Similarly, with Mackenzie Scott, I want to lift her up as an example because the organizations that have received those significant gifts from her, they're not all large, well-known institutions. Some of them are neighborhood organizations. We have one in Indiana that is a Latinx-led, Latino-led organization and a small neighborhood organization, and somehow that organization got on her radar, and they received a very significant gift. Similarly, Howard University, during the pandemic, the president was one of our speakers, received a $40 million unrestricted gift, and they had, this was the largest gift they had received in their history. The president said at the time, maybe it's been exceeded, said he actually received a call and he asked them, do I need to prepare a grant proposal? They said no. Do you want a report? They said no. Do you want some kind of accounting of the gift? This is completely unrestricted. So we are really encouraged and inspired by some of those examples because it's not just about reaching out and finding organizations that have been historically not appreciated, but also in giving them the space and the bandwidth to actually have the impact that they need to have. And that allowed Howard University to meet extraordinary needs during the pandemic in a completely unrestricted way.
So I guess I'd wrap all of that up by saying that you do not need to be held hostage to the data. We want to inspire you and fire your imagination so that you can reach out to the donors, regardless of their capacity, and inspire them to make the greatest gift that they can.
Yeah, I think that's very important to touch on that. I know in the work that we do with an organization, I work with an environmental justice organization here in Atlanta, and they're starting to see an increase in giving. Their focus is on vulnerable communities that are impacted by environmental issues that move over into health and other areas. So, in talking about that, we also want to continue to look at the fact that yes, diverse giving is something that we're all starting to see more of, and we're all starting to bring more attention to. So I think that was an important topic to touch on that. So, Laura, when you were speaking a couple of minutes ago, you talked about or mentioned donor-advised funds, and I want to turn to that for just a moment. Donor-advised funds returned as a popular giving vehicle, according to the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Donor-based funds received about $7.64 million in 2023 and was the third most popular cause by donor amount after gifts to organizations and higher education. So let's talk about donor-advised funds. So I want to start once again with Una. How does Giving USA factor? How does Giving USA factor in to and by donor-advised funds? Then we're going to turn to Susannah and Laura and have your respective organizations, ask if your respective organizations have seen an increase in DAF activity.
Wonderful question. So we track questions we get about Giving USA every year, and donor-advised funds are always at the top of that list. So how many of you have questions on donor-advised funds, how they work? Okay, I'll try to be very quick because we've been working on this for quite some time. So donor-advised funds are not new. I always say this. They've been around for more than a century, but mostly at community foundations. I am on the board of our Central Indiana Community Foundation, and we have had donor-advised funds for, almost 100 years. So it's been part of the ecosystem and landscape for a long time at community foundations. In the 1990s, there was a shift where Fidelity in 1991 became the first what's called National Donor Advised Fund, where they stood up a National Donor Advised Fund, making it possible for people who are saving for retirement to also establish a giving account. And then fast forward the tape, many nonprofits now also have donor advised funds. So for example, Indiana University Foundation, you can set up a DAF within IU. It just means that 50% of your gift can go to the university. The other 50% can go anywhere. So donor advised funds are probably the most misunderstood part of our giving because it's a vehicle. It's a way that donors give. And what we found is that nonprofits that start to think about how can we build relationships, engage with that community are very successful. Over time, we've seen a lot of interest in donor advised funds. Donors especially like the convenience, whether that's setting it up at a community foundation, one of the national funds, or with a national or local nonprofit. That is all a set of options. In Giving USA, we count donor advised funds in three ways. Certainly, community foundations, their assets held there. There's also what's called the public society benefit category. So if you have an account at Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, National Philanthropic Trust, that's considered a public society benefit. And then finally, single issue charities. I'll give you one very prominent example. The National Christian Foundation is a DAF sponsoring organization, but most of the donors there are giving towards religious purposes. So that could be counted in a different way. So you can see that it's not easy on the counting side, but there's also been a lot of learning over the decades. What we're also finding, many organizations ask me, well, how do we build relationships with donor advised fund holders? Many of them are already your donors. And you already know a lot of them. Another strategy that we've seen to be very effective is building relationships with financial advisors. So inviting them to events, because many of them are actually the first place that their clients go when they're looking for advice. We started tracking about 10 years ago where high net worth donors are getting their philanthropic counsel and advice from. And it used to be their religious leaders or their nonprofit leaders. Today, the number one place is their financial advisor. So if you want to be on the map, build those relationships with the financial advisors, invite them to your events, have special opportunities for them, because they're often the ones that will then introduce their clients to your work.
We're sometimes asked that same question. How can we build relationships with advisors to donor advised funds? And oftentimes I equate that question, you might as well be asking, how can we build relationships with donors who write checks or donors who use credit cards? It's a transaction method. You're still dealing with an individual donor who is motivated by all of the same things that motivated them to give before they created a donor advised fund. And by the way, all the cool kids have donor advised funds. So it's not just about the convenience and some of the other aspects that make them popular, but really, it's now the subject of cocktail party conversation. Having said that, I will say that our firm has a donor-advised fund. We use it to separate the timing of the gift from the purpose of the gift. For us, we fuel it when we have good years, and that way we know that we can always match our employees' giving. So we use it to match our employees' giving. It sits at the Columbus Foundation, which is a marvelous community foundation, one of the 10 largest in the country. And so that's the main thing, is that your donor is separating that liquidity moment, the opportunity to give, the ability to give because they've got the resources, from the decision about who to give it to and how much to give. But other than that, as you heard Una said, it's still an individual donor making a decision about what used to be their own money.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's funny because I think one of the most asked questions probably of most of our clients is, how do we get funding from DAFs? It is something that feels very shrouded in mystery, and that it is this kind of feeling of it as a bit of a black box that is very hard to see into. But I think that's right. It's the individuals. I think that a big piece of this is, and we have seen an increase in giving from DAFs across the board with our clients, but I do think there is also an opportunity here for firms like ours, Laura, for fundraisers that are working in this space to also do a bit more of this education that we continue to be talking about, as well as really working with wealth managers, financial advisors, to make sure that they're really clear as well on how they can be educating their DAF holders, how they can be better making an impact with those dollars that they're investing, where that can be going, what the degree of impact that can happen, as well as, again, I know I continue to beat the drum of we need to have some of this trickle down to the small and mid-sized organizations, and I think this is a really great opportunity in that sort of vein of thinking about how we can be educating those individuals is also in educating the wealth managers that they're working with.
And the other great partnership that we see in many communities is with the Community Foundation that's doing donor education, and not just educating donors about ways to give, but also holding up some of the nonprofit organizations that are making an incredible difference on the ground, but might not have those same resources. The other trend that we're seeing is the democratization of donor-advised funds. They started out with very high thresholds. You had to give, let's say, a minimum of $10,000 to create a donor-advised fund. We're seeing funds now that certainly have lowered that, and we are seeing funds where the minimum investment is $0, is $1. Especially we're seeing some workplace DAFs where you can do payroll deduction to begin to create and build up your donor-advised fund. So I think that democratization of the availability of this tool, whether it's through community foundations or some of the national funds, is also going to begin to extend that benefit.
Susannah, Una and Laura, would you please talk a bit more about some of the opportunities that you mentioned? And what I want to specifically mention is that Giving USA annual report on philanthropy has been examining giving since 1967, or Giving USA has been examining giving since 1967. But I want to hone in on the last 40 years, for example, 1983 to 2023. So one of the areas we want to spend a couple of minutes talking about now is discussing today the state of total giving as a percentage of the gross domestic product, particularly during the last 40 years. So from 1.7% to 2 it went up a bit from 40 years ago, 1.7% to 2% in 2023. So when talking about opportunities and when looking at giving as a share of the gross domestic product, is the challenge to determine what we need to do as a sector and a community to move the needle. Is that the challenge, or are there other challenges that we should be thinking about?
Yes, and you can jump in on the Generosity Commission as well. We at the school, we've been tracking, as you've heard, overall giving. We've been doing it, Giving USA has been around since the 1950s. So it's the longest running report anywhere in the world on American giving and certainly on giving around the world. What is encouraging is that giving is growing. I said even during a tough time, giving grew. But as a share of the overall economy, it has been stuck at 2%. Now, we have taken this data and taken it down to the household level and then looked at what fraction of income, pre-tax income, are Americans giving. And that is around 2%. So if you want to calculate what that percentage is for your own family, we have a new tool on the school's website, the Givometer. You can go and take a quiz very quickly.
Is that Generosity for Life?
Yes, generosityforlife.org. And we have a tool called the Givometer. So in your spare time today, please experiment with that. But what's interesting is that that is also 2%. Americans are giving the same amount that they gave in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. It's been relatively flat at 2%. So there is a challenge on the table for all of us, which is what would we have to do differently to move the needle on that 2%? A colleague once asked me, what was the share that Americans gave during the Great Depression? Let me take some guesses in the audience. What was that? The Great Depression, so a very long time ago, in the 1920s. 2%, okay, right around 2%. So even during the Great Depression, it was 2%. So there is a moment here where we're asking, we have new technology, we have DAFs, we have all these new ways of giving. Wealth is growing. We have a lot of wealthy households in our country, more than ever before. Wealth is rising. So why is it stuck at 2%? And there are many ways to look at this question. We could say, well, households need to give more. You could certainly say that. And you could also say, well, maybe nonprofits need to ask for more. We need to dust off our dreams and fire and inspire our communities. And you could also say maybe it's a public policy issue that we need more incentives and more opportunities to give. And I think all of those are true. All three buckets are important. And I think I've shared with many of you that we've taken it as a personal goal in our own household to encourage our children to give. And it's going to sound very stringent to all of you in the audience, so bear with me. But we ask them to forego birthday gifts and instead have their friends give to a charity that they've selected. And we've done the same as parents. Now, how popular do you think we were as parents when we... Not popular, but it has really caught on. And birthdays, we pick a charity and give to that in their honor. And all their friends started doing it. So generosity, like anything else, can have its own momentum and actually build a community as you go. So encourage you at your own workplace, household, in your own community, think about how you can encourage more people to get involved in philanthropy, whether that's giving money, whether that's giving time, whether that's sharing stories about what's happening in the sector. Make that part of your own personal mission to encourage more generosity. It's such a big part of what has made our country, our communities so vibrant. And I think for the future of our country, we also need to encourage more investment in the philanthropic sector. So that's my...
I absolutely. And I think you mentioned as kind of that triumvirate too. You mentioned policy. And I think it is such a key piece of this as we think about that needle a bit is we know this is a very important election coming up and we all have a bit of anxiety, I'm guessing. But really, I think an important piece that's going to be coming up with this is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is going to be expiring in 2025. And the outcome of this election is going to have an impact on that. And I think that is an area where we know that the 2018 passing of that reduced incentives for people to donate, and we did see an impact from it as a sector. I know that there was a lot of fear around that when that happened, and we have seen that play out in real time. And so this is going to be an area where, depending on who ends up in the White House shortly, I think we can anticipate that that is going to be an issue on the table and something of importance for the nonprofit sector in donations.
Yeah, people generally don't the impulse to give isn't created through the tax incentives, but the timing of the gift, the magnitude of the gift, the kind of transaction are all affected by the policy environment. I'm going to say some economic words, don't cringe. But I think what we saw in 2021 is that it popped up to almost 2.2% of GDP was given in 2021, and so we know that the charitable giving economy is elastic. We know that there's the capacity for Americans to give more than they do. I think that sometimes we think from a position of scarcity, that there's a fixed pie, and if somebody gets a bigger slice of pie, that means I'm going to get a smaller slice of pie. I think that what we all need to be doing is working on that culture of abundance and saying that there's room for the pie to grow. We can all work together for that growth. And in fact, in about 2019, the Giving USA Foundation was part of creating something called the Generosity Commission, which was really looking at some of the factors that influence the capacity of Americans to give to the causes that they care about. Their final reports, they commissioned a lot of research, and their final reports are just rolling out now. So if you get a chance, visit the Generosity Commission, and you'll see some specific actions that they're calling for, and also some community conversations that they're trying to instigate. And with that, I think, Jennifer, we turn it back to you for audience questions.
Absolutely. So we're going to kind of turn the table here a bit and give the audience an opportunity to ask our panelists questions, burning questions that might be on your mind. Maybe you want to ask a question about something you've heard today. So let's open it up and hear from you.
Testing. Hello. Thank you for coming here today and sharing time and space. Thanks everybody else for coming too. My name is Em. I work in development with an organization called the National Young Farmers Coalition. And my question is personal, I suppose. So I'm an entry-level employee, but I support our corporate engagement manager. I support our associate director of development who works with individual giving and major donors and funders that our EDs work with. I'm trying to understand because I'll be engaging with donors at some point, how do you speak to funders when you yourself come from a background that is not able to give? Like, my family would not be able to give in like a long-term or substantial sense. I myself have donated to campaigns, maybe like a couple of dollars, but in hard times I've had to like cancel that and cut back. So now imagining myself in the nonprofit sector speaking to donors, I'm thinking like, how do I convince you when I haven't even convinced myself to give?
Can I jump in here? I love that question because I think that question is from the heart, and clearly you are starting out on your career, and I'll say just a few things. First, I would encourage you to come to the Lilly Family School and take some classes. We have virtual classes. The Fundraising School provides entry-level standalone virtual classes, in-person classes, but talk to me. I'm happy to link you up with that. And then the second one is to reclaim the narrative about who's a giver. For too long, people have thought, I can only give $1. Does that count? Yes, it counts. What we have seen is that people of all different backgrounds have so much to offer organizations. It may be that financially, you have limited resources, but you have your voice, you have your platform, you have your time, you have your networks. I just want to share a paradigm shift that we've really been pushing. For a long time, people have talked about the 3 T's. You all know the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. Today, we've expanded that T spectrum to include testimony, your voice, your ties, your networks. And what's important for everyone to realize is that we, in our own right, are all philanthropists. Whether you're contributing $1, a few pennies, or writing a $10 or $10 billion check, your gift has value. And I think the sector also needs to recognize that, because certainly there are people that are making 6-figure, 7-figure, even 10-figure gifts, but there are also people who are making smaller donations consistently to support organizations. And we need to value all of those gifts. All of those gifts matter, and all are important. Again, your time, the intellect you could bring to an organization. So realize that what you're contributing has value. Don't be intimidated by the size of someone else's checkbook or bank account, but also realize that your own talents and gifts are appreciated and of significance to the sector. And finally, I'd just say that in this field, it's important to have mentors. So people who can invest in you as a young professional and really see the potential in you, see that sense of possibility. So surround yourself with people who will pour into you, invest in you, and help you reach your next level. I have great faith in you. I can't wait to see what you do next.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. I'll build on that a bit as well. It's M, right? So I was going to share the same thing. Think about your giving, not just of treasure, but time, talent, treasure, testimony, and ties. And I suspect that when you tally that up, you're an extraordinarily generous person. So think about that to reclaim the narrative, reclaim your power. You know, we've done a lot of work in the women's funding space, worked with women's funds, with YWCAs, with the Global Fund for Women, once led by a mutual friend of ours. And here's how they're changing the narrative. Because in our society, we give power to money. We think of money and we think about power. And for many of us, women, people of color, then the act of asking somebody for money after we've fought for equality puts us back in that position of subjugating ourselves. Please, sir, may I have some money? The women's funding movement has really shifted that narrative to say, no, money does not have power in and of itself. Money is a tool. And in order to address society's challenges and take advantages of opportunities, things like it's agriculture, right? Things like agriculture, what we need is a whole community to come to the table. And you're going to come to the table because you can mobilize the masses. And you're going to come to the table because you're a subject matter expert. And you're going to come to the table because, yes, you do have access to capital. But we're all going to come to the table as equals to solve these problems. We're all bringing something of value. Money isn't the only thing of value that's coming. And then the final thing I would say, just on a practical level, as you interact with those donors and funders, ask questions. Don't feel like you need to persuade, or there's not some silver gilded language that suddenly loosens the checkbooks and gets the gifts. Ask questions. What inspires you? When you've made a gift, what has really made you feel great about that gift? And what are some experiences you've had that weren't so successful? How do you determine which causes you're going to support? Go in loaded with an arsenal of questions, not persuasive talking points.
Good morning. My name is Takiwa Smith. So I have a question about, somebody made a comment about meeting financial advisors and getting more. I have been getting a random check for the past year and a half, and I finally figured out where it comes from, so I have to send a thank you note. But when I think about, I was like, who is giving us this money? Thank you, but I don't know. But the question that I have is, when I think about the financial advisors that I come across, I don't even see wanting to talk to them about who in their portfolio can donate, because it seems like they're just always trying to get a client. So how can we find and identify those who will really say, oh, my clients are looking for places to give their money, and how do we find those that want to have that conversation trying to sell us versus selling us products?
Yes, I will jump in here because, as I mentioned, wear many hats, but one of them is on the board of the Community Foundation. And the way that we've done that is invite them in for special topics. So, for example, at the Community Foundation, we'll host a forum on education, and they are very interested in that. Or, for example, I present the high net worth study every year, and we invite a lot of the financial advisors. So think about events as a starting point where you can invite them, where there's mutual benefit to them. And that's a chance for them to know you. What was interesting to me is many of the financial advisors, they know a lot about financial advising, but they don't know a lot about philanthropy or nonprofits. So they actually want some help. There are other topics that they're interested in that you could also help open the door. Maybe it's what's happening in the community that you could invite them to, a site visit. And you, because it's, whether it's the banks or the private firms themselves, there is such a wide spectrum. When we say financial advisors, it's not a monolithic group. It's everyone from the retail to the large banks to even multinationals. So have small group events, also invite them for educational opportunities, and then reach out to them one-on-one. Coffee, breakfast, those kinds of things. The final point I'll make is that it's mutually beneficial for them to get to know you. So you are not just asking them, you can be a source of information. I'll give you a very also simple example, a family foundation that I'm on the board of. I asked a question about impact investing. They said, well, our firm, this was our financial advisor, they said, we don't have that expertise. So how do we get that expertise? Introducing them to other people. So Laura's advice is very good. Ask them questions. What would you like to learn more about? What are gaps in your own portfolio? And maybe you can curate some sessions for them based on their own interest. So I encourage you to be curious and expand to include this audience, because often those financial advisors are gatekeepers. They're the ones that know the donors, that have the donor advised funds and already have the relationships.
Looks like in the back.
Hello. My name is Lainey. Thank you for being here today. I apologize in advance. I have a math question. So, can you talk a little bit about your calculation when you apply inflation, when you're trying to decide that impact and that change in rate? I know that it's the CPI, but is it a point-in-time comparison? Is it a rolling average? Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Yes.
if you need to take a nap, I apologize. I can come talk to you about this separately.
Yes.
But I've been curious, and we've taken a look at that and just wanted to know, particularly because inflation was really all over the place in the calendar year of 2023, very high and then back to normal.
Yes,
So
yes.
how did you do that?
Yeah, so we take an annual average, so it's not month to month. If you have been tracking inflation over the past few years, it's been a wild ride. We've had 8%, it's come down to 3%. But keep in mind, these are very atypical numbers for inflation. These are for the data. How many people are data people in the audience? Raise your hand. Okay, so quite a few. All right, so if you've been studying this, it has been, in fact, there's a lot to keep track of. In graduate school, we were told that the U.S., the Fed, had solved the problem of high inflation. We weren't going to have this issue anymore. This was in the 1990s. Business cycles had been smooth, and there wouldn't be those problems anymore. Well, COVID cast doubt on that and certainly upended a lot of those economic assumptions. And now we're very far from the Fed's target of 2%, certainly if we look over time. So we take that annual average, and it's the CPI, but there are many different inflation measures. And there's certainly ones that are specific to parts of the country, urban versus rural, some that include sort of a weighted, focused on cost of living, housing, food, et cetera, are weighted more heavily. But we use the CPI, and it's the annual. So what we take is there's the Giving USA number, and then we adjust that by the current population CPI index, and also weighted by the basket of goods that most Americans buy. So it's just your standard measure.
So, and I'll say we take it a step further because, as you've heard, inflation hasn't been like this in 40 years. But what we know is that the Giving USA data goes back to 1967. And so at our firm, because we're members of the Giving Institute and participate in Giving USA, we reached out and asked for the data, both current and inflation-adjusted data going back to 1967. If you Google Giving is Resilient at Benefactor Group, you will see we've created a tool, and we're actually updating it right now. It'll be out maybe today, where you can press on some buttons and say, what happens to charitable giving in periods of high inflation? The reality is there doesn't seem to be a really strong link between inflation and charitable giving. What happens to charitable giving in various kinds of economic circumstances? And then what will be coming out in the next day or two is, what influence do presidential elections have on charitable giving? So I'll let you go do the research and figure that one out while I think we take one more question from the audience.
Good morning. Thank you all. My name is Jazz, and I'm a development director with Boy Scouts here in Atlanta. My question is tied a little bit. I appreciate your sharing the paradigm shift. My question is tied to, how do you encourage, as consultants and those in this sector, those who are in a city like Atlanta, or in Atlanta that are smaller, because I've been involved in development in big box nonprofits where corporate giving is not an issue, but when you are dealing with smaller nonprofits, what are some of those just insights and encouragements that you tend to give?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the big pieces is fundraising is always going to be relational. I think that's something we see is regardless of the size nonprofit you're working with, relationships are always going to be what leads that. So I think it's really looking in that portfolio of who you're working with, be that individuals, foundations. If you are an organization that has a strong corporate portfolio, I know that's not the case for many nonprofits, but really looking at that and just digging into it and really making sure you're doing the due diligence of continuing to maintain and build those relationships, I think is really key, and where we see the best traction in fundraising efforts. There's always going to be that desire to continue to find new prospects and to expand that, but I think really starting with that base of supporters and really focusing how you can retain and continue to deepen those relationships as a first step is going to really yield great impact from that, and feels a bit more attainable, I think, for immediate wins.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of the things that we've seen, so later on you might hear about it, and I'll be outside, but I've just published a book called The Endowment Handbook. And one of the things that we saw in the endowment handbook is that the likelihood that somebody will make a gift to your endowment, often through a planned gift, is not the one-time shooting star that gave you a $50,000 gift once. It's that loyal donor that started out giving you $100 a year and then $250, and maybe they never went above giving you $100 a year, but they've given to you 7 out of the last 10, or started their giving journey with you 20 years ago. That donor is very likely to be receptive to a conversation about continuing their giving today. And by the way, somebody who makes arrangements for a planned gift is more likely to continue their annual support and give more. I know that if we think through scarcity, they're giving it to us tomorrow, they won't give to us today. No, they're giving to your tomorrows. They want you to thrive today. So talk to your bosses and say, if we really want to fuel our annual giving, the best thing we could do is look at our planned giving programs and think about how we're building endowment with those.
I just want to add one more point, and that's the power of transformational boards. Don't underestimate boards. So if it's a small organization that has lofty ambitions, has a bold vision, has some amazing plans, transformational plans, start to look at who you can recruit to the board. Several years ago, I went to the Board Source Conference, and I just went to many different sessions. And what I saw there was so inspiring. You saw how a small organization suddenly became this powerhouse, and it was because they aligned the vision with the board and brought along board members that had leadership skills, capacity, and network. So back to the point, it wasn't just about do they have the capacity to give, but what about their ties? Who are they connected to, their networks? What about their testimony? How are they using their platform, wherever that is, corporations, foundations, in the community, to elevate the organization? And that was what moved the needle for those organizations. So I often say to small organizations who have big ambitions, who's on your board? Because you need that partnership from the board as well as the internal staff, because the staff can be fantastic, but if they don't have that support from the board, they can't achieve their potential.
Yeah, we're told there's one. Thank you, Una. We're told there's one more question in the back that we'd like to get to. Is there another question?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm inspired by everyone here. How about you guys? Yes. Right? We've got end of year coming up. Come on, applaud yourselves. Thank you for taking my question. Thank you, panel, for being here and giving us some insights today. My name's Maria Antonetti. I'm the Director of Development at Aurora Theatre. Thank you for your call out to the Woodruff Art Center. We're experiencing some things in the arts and culture sector that the panel spoke about earlier. And as I'm reminded, we are seeing some things on the national stage like trust-based philanthropy that are on the rise. While I'm focusing on building my relationships with the trustees of the planned giving giving folks, of the older generation that we get to enjoy at Aurora Theatre. I'm also wanting to find new and innovative ways to inspire the next generation, my generation, millennials, the generation that are coming behind me. So what are some things that we're seeing? Maybe, I know we don't have any kind of special fortune telling or magical ball crystals or anything, but what are some things that we're seeing on the horizon when we think of the generational shift that we are also in this natural season of philanthropy, in ways that we can maybe get ahead on inspiring those relationships, inspiring different ways to give? Maybe that's that way to maximize online giving a little bit more, and just different techniques or tools that you might have when we think of what's coming on the forefront in the next 20 years in philanthropy.
So two things come to mind for me, and Laura, I'm sure you're going to have some good insights on this as well, but the first is, I think we're at a really exciting moment in philanthropy with the the intergenerational transfer of wealth that's happening right now. And so I think we've seen this in Atlanta, right? There are several foundations where there is a transition of what generation is responsible for giving, and also even just within the staff at foundations, there is such a really exciting moment right now where I think there are foundations that are rethinking their giving, rethinking their grant-making practices, which is a great time and opportunity to be having conversations with many of the family foundations and private foundations in the community. It's a really, really great time for that as they're rethinking their strategic priorities, as they have new plans that they're rolling out and new priorities that they're really focused on, in many cases which are really responsive to immediate needs of nonprofits. So that feels like one great opportunity. And then the second is, I think, also this attention. I'm sure the Giving Tuesday report that came out today is going to have some on this too, but also thinking about where the ways that different generations are giving is also a great opportunity. I think seeing there's several reports that have come out that are really looking at trends around the way that Gen Z is giving and how they are really activated through online giving, through social platforms, et cetera. And I think paying attention to some of those things and not just focusing on the sort of pale, stale male donor base that can exist at times, and going into sort of who are these new generations of donors, who is this broader, sort of more diverse range of donors that you can also be thinking about, is a really great opportunity.
So since you mentioned it, part of what inspired me to write this book, other than the fact that there hadn't been a really how-to book about endowments in 20 years, is the intergenerational transfer of wealth. So right now, baby boomers and older generations hold over $100 trillion. That's more wealth than any group of people have ever assembled in the history of the world. And of that, we believe about we will spend some of it. Some of it will go to taxes, but about $84 trillion will pass on. Now, of that, $12 trillion is thought to go to nonprofit organizations. If that $12 trillion were endowed, the draw on that $12 trillion would exceed total giving in 2020. It is a massive amount of money. And if every one of the 1.3 to 1.5 million nonprofits in America got an equal share, you'd all get $8 million. So you'd be drawing $350,000 from your new $8 million endowment. Guess what? You will not all get an equal share. The people who work on engaging those donors, inspiring them, securing gifts today and for the future are the ones that will get that. And the other $72 trillion, it's not lost. It's going to generations X, Y, Z, and A. So how do you inspire those generations that may have modest giving abilities today, may have modest giving abilities for their entire life, but they're still passionate about you? And I would give you 2 clues for that. One is stop talking about yourself as an organization or an institution. You are a cause. How do you talk about your work as a cause? Which, by the way, is a great board exercise, to sit with the board and say, how do we talk about ourselves as a cause, not as an organization or a mission or an institution? So that's number 1. And number 2, make the donor the agent of change. So the answer is not, when you give to us, we can make it possible to put great things on our stage. Your gift puts great things on our stage. Make the donor the agent of change. You're the vessel through which they're giving, but you're not the agent of change. They are. And I think those are 2 things that will really appeal to those next-gen donors.
Fantastic. I think the only thing I would add is we need to start thinking about how to bring the joy of giving back. And that's really important for these younger donors. They want to have fun while they're giving. And we see that with so many of the new approaches. Over the past few years, we've worked with a platform called Omaze. How many of you have heard of Omaze? So you can bid on bid on experiences. They don't have to be charitable, and at the same time donate to your favorite cause. For example, you could bid on a lunch with George and Amal Clooney while you're donating to your favorite charity. And this, working with Omaze, was a bit of a window into what it looks like to be working across generations, across different types of donors. During the pandemic, we saw that about 40% of Americans had given either via social media or crowdfunding. Most of them were younger donors that were giving via those different methods. And as we drill down into it, younger donors, they want to give to a cause, not to an organization. They want to see the impact, and they want to be involved in the organization. Our local United Way president shared that she used to have a dinner for young donors. And one year, the young donors said they didn't want a dinner. They didn't want a recognition dinner or a plaque. And she thought her whole team was very confused. Well, what do we do if we don't do a dinner? And what would you like to do instead? They posed that question. And the group said they wanted to go bowling. Bowling, they had never done bowling before, but the United Way president, to her credit, stood up this bowling event. It was a lot of fun. The donors enjoyed it. The younger donors, they were more engaged. And she actually said they saved money on the bowling outing. So my biggest set of takeaways from that anecdote is that we should be open to these new ways of giving, embrace the joy, the warm glow, the joy of giving, and also listen to those younger donors, meet them where they are, understand what it is that they care about, how they want to be engaged, what their motivations are. And this is not a one-size-fits-all giving economy. We all need to, we have the opportunity to tailor those opportunities for younger donors, for diverse donors, for women, and for every member of our community.
So thank you for joining us this morning. It was an excellent, I think, exchange of information, conversation. The questions from all of you were great. So again, thank you for being here. Susannah Darrow, Dr. Una Osili, Laura MacDonald, thank you for a great conversation this morning.